The Federal Reserve came out today and held its key interest rate at 4.5% as expected. Investors did not like the press conference after the interest rate decision. Powell made some hawkish comments and the market went down. I'm here to say that I think Powell's trying to save face at this point, and I don't blame him, by the way. First of all, I have to say that the economic reports coming out recently have been stronger than expected, including today in the US we saw GDP go up by 3%, much higher than expected. That was for Q2. In the Q1 GDP was negative, but nevertheless 3% is a strong number. And we have seen a lot of other reports coming in better than expected recently. Now, we can point to other softer reports or softer economic data saying that the economy is struggling here, whether it's the labor market, etc. But the headline numbers are actually pretty good. If you take a look at unemployment, 4.1%. That's a good number for unemployment. And Powell pointed that out and said the labor market's still strong. Look, I'm one of the first people to say the labor market looks like it's in trouble with a whole bunch of other numbers, as far as average wage earnings growth goes, or the jolts, et cetera, et cetera. But the actual unemployment rate is still very reasonable. And everybody's waiting for that inflection point where we start to see some of the softer data show up in the headline data. And it just hasn't happened yet. If we take a look at the inflation rate, well, inflation's 2.7%. That's way above target. And if you take a look at core PCE, it's above 2%. Now, I want to talk about this 2% rate for a while, this target rate. 2% is a made-up number. There's no scientific reason why it should be 2%. Ideally speaking, in theory, it should be 0. So we're well above that. Now, everybody sort of agrees that 0 might be a little bit dangerous because if we go down to 0% and we start to go negative, that's deflation, and that can really put a wrench in the economy and slow it down. And we don't want that. So yes, there is some number above 0% that actually makes sense. And the Federal Reserve years ago just chose arbitrarily 2%. And we're above that. And we're not showing signs that we're going below it right now. We're seeing inflation start to level out here and go back up. Yes, we can start pulling out the numbers once again and take a look at, well, this is what shelter's doing. And, shelter hasn't worked its way through the system, or this is what this is doing. And pulling all these numbers out. But the headline numbers are still, and in case of inflation, still higher than expected or higher than target and not showing a meaningful path lower. Powell commented on inflation expectations. Inflation expectations have been increasing, and that's true. So from the headline data, there's really no reason to be lowering the federal funds rate at this point. Everybody's spoiled with the COVID rates and wants to get back down there. Now, of course, Trump wants the federal funds rate to be 1% or less. His perspective is, well, he says the economy's going great. Well, if the economy's going great, then you don't need a lower federal funds rate. And his perspective is that, well, the debt, government debt could be financed much cheaper. The government could save $1 trillion a year just by having a much lower federal funds rate. But the central bank, the Federal Reserve, they do not have any responsibility for the financing of the government, the interest rate with government debt. They are independent for that one reason. Their only two mandates are maximum employment and price stability. And it's not about trying to make government debt cheaper. The fact that government debt's so expensive means that the governments have been borrowing too much money and going deeper and deeper into debt. And investors are starting to say, well, I'm sorry, we've got to actually charge you a higher yield if you're going to keep borrowing from us because you're kind of reckless. And this is going on all around the world. In my latest newsletter for July, I talk about what's happening in Japan. We're starting to see interest rates go up at the long end of the curve. because bond investors are saying, I'm sorry, your debt's too high. You're spending like drunken sailors. You're looking all over Europe, we're seeing the same phenomenon. Germany, although it has a lower GDP, debt to GDP ratio, is starting to increase their debt. France is a basket case. I mean, the country is really a basket case economically. They keep instituting terrible policies, and they're getting deeper and deeper into debt. What's happening? We're finding investors are saying, bond investors, well, we want a higher yield at the long end of the curve. That's true for the UK as well. UK is, I've talked about the UK a lot in newsletters and how it's an economic basket case and doing all the wrong things. But that's true for the US as well. A lot of people thought when Trump got in, he was going to cut government spending and bring some fiscal responsibility in. But that's not the case. If you take a look at the projected deficits going forward, they're actually quite large, and they're back-end loaded into his term, so they may actually never come about. So huge amounts of spending. Canada, absolutely incredible, reckless government spending here. It's estimated that the federal deficit this year will be $92 billion, absolutely astronomical. So it's not just one government, it's all of them. And you don't want to have central banks running around and saying, well, we have to start to consider that the government needs to borrow more money and we need to lower the rates for them to do that. Because that is a huge issue. So Powell weighed out the labor situation, said, look, it's really stable, it's strong. Inflation is still higher than our target here, and we have to stay our course. And he's focusing on inflation because that's the main concern at this point. The employment picture is not a concern at this point. It's very strong in his mind. He's focusing on inflation. So the inflation numbers just haven't come down to target. Now, I think we're going to start to see the Federal Reserve cut rates shortly. Now, what we saw in the meeting, the press conference after, we saw the odds of a September rate cut going down because Powell was quite hawkish. But if we look back at history, when you start to see other members of the Federal Reserve Board actually dissenting, what happens after that? What's the pattern after that? Now, today there were 2 dissenters. We haven't had 2 dissenters on the board since 1993. A long time ago, because these meetings are really choreographed, really, and it's only when things really get stretched out or some political stuff gets involved or whatever do you start to see some dissension take place. So we saw Bowman and Waller both dissent. Perhaps they're going for Powell's job. That's a total possibility. I've mentioned that before, particularly Waller. But if you look at all the other times where there's been 1 dissenting member or 2, what you see the pattern is that it's just a matter of time before interest rates start to go down. If you look at the 10-year yield, then you see the 10-year yield on average starts to go down at 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months. It's even possible that Powell wants to actually trim the rate, start trimming rates. It's totally possible, but if you think about what's happened, he doesn't want to seem like he's being bullied into it. So it's almost like because Trump has put so much pressure on Powell that he has no choice but to stand up to Powell unless the data clearly says that he should act otherwise. And that's really what's going on here. And I think Trump will probably continue to keep the pressure up on him. The smart thing to do, I think, would be just to back off here, and as far as that goes. But I think at this point, Powell is trying to save face. He's saying, well, you know what? I've got to save face here. I can't make it look like we are not independent of the government. We are independent of the government, and we're not going to be bullied around. And so I was totally expecting Powell to come out with hawkish comments again, and he's really going to be data dependent at this point. And I think it's really quite an act of saving face as well.